Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Hello, everybody. This is Salil Tripathi from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And I'm here during this somber week of recalling and recollecting the memories of what happened 25 years ago, the execution of the Ogoni Nine, Ken Saro Wiwa and his associates, who were executed after what was widely regarded as an unfair and sham trial in the Niger Delta. They were fighting for trying to get pollution reduced in the Niger Delta, and they were campaigning against oil companies, and these were trumped-up charges against them. And the international community intervened, but they were not successful. And it changed, for many people, the whole notion of what business and human rights are all about. I'm going to be talking today with Richard Boele. Richard and I go back a long way. We met many years ago in London when he was with Amnesty International's Business and Human Rights Group at the Amnesty UK, and I worked with Amnesty International. But more important than that, before that, Richard was at Body Shop, the company that spiritedly took on the Ogoni campaign. He's now in Australia, in Sydney, where he works with KPMG, working on environment, sustainability and human rights and trying to make the world a better place. Richard, thank you for joining us. Tell us, what did Ken Saro Wiwa and the Ogonis mean to you?
Excellent question, and just your introduction made me reflect in terms of the time and the emotions. There's no question that they left a very significant impression on me in terms of that dynamic between a corporate actor and communities that experience very real and visceral and fatal consequences of some of those corporate actions. So to me, the number one challenge was always, Ken, at the first UNPO, so the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organisation. Now I'm going back now to 1993. And it was January, and it was the General Assembly. There was Ken Saro Wiwa, looking up at me. I was quite a bit taller than he was, and him challenging me on Shell's performance in Ogoni, saying, look, here's the actions that this company is undertaking, and here's the impact and the consequences on my people. And I've got to be honest with you, I was listening to this and I just couldn't believe. Mm-hmm. And I didn't believe. And he picked that up. He said, you don't believe me, do you? And I said, I'm sorry, but just my direct experience, I don't understand how such a significant global company could act in the way that you're talking about. I just cannot reconcile that. And he said, well, mark my words, and in time you will come to understand. And it only took 2 or 3 months, and that was a pipeline being laid in March, and the Nigerian military, because it was a military dictatorship, and that was a joint venture. Yeah, so Shell was a minority shareholder of that oil company in Nigeria, and the troops were sent in to protect construction workers laying a pipeline. And as a result of peaceful protests, there was tension. Troops opened fire and people died. And that, to me, is probably the most significant lasting legacy, is that should never happen. We should not have economic actors participating in our economy, in our society, where there's an acceptance that people need to die for that economic activity to be undertaken. And that particular incident itself catalysed, the voluntary, and made a significant contribution to the voluntary principles and their awareness in terms of other interactions between public security in Nigeria and private actors there. But Shell did. They became the first major multinational to incorporate a commitment to respect human rights into their business principles. 2 years, fast forward to 1997. But for me personally, it transformed or sensitized me to an actor that I hadn't appreciated as a major actor in terms of that human rights consequence. my previous experience had been in 1987 in Tibet, where I'd seen Chinese security forces shoot and kill Tibetans who were peacefully protesting in front of me. And that was my key first, I guess, deep sensitization to human rights and that sense of responsibility, that sense of having to witness and to support others in having a voice. And then fast forward to everything that Ken taught me. And I'll have to be fair, there was a two-way conversation though, because, there were things which Ken asked me to do that I just said no. If we're going to be successful in your voice and the Ogoni voice being heard, this is the approach. And some of that was around, you'll appreciate that, is, Ken saying, but in Nigeria, if we say in the press that 10 people have been killed, everyone automatically discounts it to 5. That's why we have to say 10. And I said, well, here it's different. If I say 10 and it subsequently comes out that it's 5, no one's ever going to believe another press release or, read another story coming from us as a source again. Whereas if we say it's 1 and then it increases, we get multiple stories. So there was that real difference around the context and how to tell the story of what the Ogoni people were experiencing. But for me personally, I would not be here today doing what I'm doing if it hadn't been for that very intense, short but very intense, but very privileged opportunity to work with Ken and Mossop and the Ogoni people.
Right. Tell me about the Body Shop campaign itself. How was it conceived? How was it designed? And how did you work on that?
Well, it started, my direct relationship started when Ken Wiwa, Ken Saro Wiwa's son, was sent to Chogan, Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which was in Auckland in New Zealand, in November 1995. So we are talking exactly 25 years ago. And Body Shop asked me, because my position at UNPO had been supported by them, and Anita had funded that position and supported that position, that I'd left UNPO, and they called me and they said, Richard, we need a campaign to go and support Ken. And that's what I did. I was in the middle of Australia, packed bags, got on a plane, flew to New Zealand, had 2 or 3 days to prepare. And it was extraordinary. The Body Shop locally just said, what do you need? They set me up with an office. They set me up with people, a team. And I got ready to receive Ken. And then we went on a campaign, with prime ministers and foreign ministers to speak about what we thought was about to happen. And as you pointed out in the introduction, Salil, that was unsuccessful. It wasn't just that Ken Saro Wiwa and the other 8 were executed; it was that they were executed during Chogan, and it was that if you like, thumbing of the Nigerian military dictatorship. If you like, thumbing world opinion, not caring about world opinion, almost daring the world to do something that resulted in those terrible deaths being on the front page the following day. Yeah. So that led to me then being invited to go and join the Body Shop in the UK. So that then was what I did, and that campaign was about the Ogoni 19, which was then subsequently the Ogoni 20. So it was, he talked about them as trumped-up charges. There were a set, and there was a subset of those that were actually being applied to another 20, what were largely regarded as both activists, and it's fair to say I think some of them, they weren't necessarily directly activists. They weren't sort of office holders in Mossop or formally. They were just swept up into a group that were targeted, and that was the focus of when I arrived at the Body Shop in December 1995. That was my focus, was the Ogoni 20, and we had I was very pleased to say that we were able to see them all released, and that was probably one of my highlights in my whole career as a human rights activist, is to receive to receive one of them in my home and have him stay with me overnight. So when you do the work we do, that is one of those wonderful moments, is to think, oh my goodness me, here's someone who, if we hadn't have acted, and all those people hadn't have acted in the way they did, this person might not be here today.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's enormously gratifying. The question I had was the fact that Body Shop decided to stand on the soapbox and take on this issue, of course, articulating the views of others. there has been a lot of movement about human rights defenders. Companies are being asked not to use strategic legal actions against public participation. The so-called slap cases is one such example.
Yep.
Or speaking up for those who are victims. Here in the US where I am now, I noticed that a lot of companies spoke up for refugee rights and asylum rights when the Trump administration cracked down on them. And so this whole idea of using your position and power of influence to speak up, do you think we have reached some kind of a sweet spot? Do you expect more companies to speak up on climate, more companies to speak up on human rights? You worked on Tibet in the past. Do you think people are going to speak up on Uyghurs? Do you see that as an optimistic scenario? Or do you think that these are still aberrations and the exceptions driven largely by corporate executives because of their personal conscience?
Yeah, no, look, it's an excellent question. Look, if I took my direct experience, and that's probably what I need to do is separate my aspiration or my hope from, well, what am I evidencing through my day-to-day work? I'd say my aspiration and my hope is that corporate actors will do that, not just because it's a individual's commitment, and that was Anita Roddick, and I think that was the intent of your question, right? There was no question that it was Anita Roddick's personal commitment to seeing human rights promoted that gave me the resources and the platform as the international human rights campaigner for The Body Shop, to run the Ogoni campaign and to challenge, to have one corporate challenge another corporate in terms of their human rights performance. It was an extraordinary thing to be doing in the 1990s. Fast forward to where we are today. I think we've seen an incredible transformation for some parts of our economy and those business actors in those parts of the economy as a result of the UN guiding principles, as a result of increasing investor challenging and interest, as a result of, and in some ways, I really do appreciate the change that seems to be possible from strategic resolution at AGMs. It's very interesting to see what's possible with that. And in some ways, that's maybe perhaps a countervailing technique to the slap technique, that in terms of looking to produce positive outcomes in terms of corporate behaviour. I'm optimistic, but then when we do this work, I don't think you can have a long-term career without being a glass half full person. You have to constantly be optimistic and look for the successes that are there, and that's where I evidence what I've seen in the Australian context in response to the Modern Slavery Act. I've been pleasantly surprised at the number of times that the conversation is opened with what do we need to do to comply with the Act. And so to be fair, it's a reluctant and it's a minimal compliance question around responding to yet another piece of legislation that's come through where, as business actors, we're being asked to solve society's ills. And that's the tone, and I've heard it. I continue to hear it. Now, the flip side is the wonderful times there are that you start with that, but you're able to lead those senior leaders, those executive members into a conversation around it. Why would you just look at modern slavery? Because that sits on a spectrum. Don't you want to know where you may potentially also be risking harming people? Because this is fundamentally about people. And you, in your business, day to day, not wanting to harm people, not just your employees, and I think that's a well-honed conversation. That's in some ways a good basis, is that safety conversation. But this is about all the people that you touch and how you touch them. Don't you want to know where else those other risks are? And human rights risk lens being a fresh lens, and it does. It does, and that's we as KPMG Australia, that's been part of my ongoing project around transformation and pushing the envelope on that. What's possible? And we were acquired 5 years ago. First 2 years had its challenges. I think we've spoken about that in the previous podcast, Salil, in terms of coming into KPMG. but just what I've been able to experience and see in the last year and a half with my team working and supporting the KPMG Australia Human Rights Working Group, and to have our Chief Risk Officer and our Chief Operating Officer and our CFO, that he has both of those in his one role, to hear them both engage with human rights language and start to frame potential impacts on people and risk to people using human rights language is extraordinarily encouraging as a lifelong human rights campaigner. But really, to me, and I really should, I'll just share the sort of sense of, one of the conversations that my CFO, COO, has in those working groups, where he said, "Look, Richard, yet again, we've just had an hour meeting and I've learned, X, Y, Z in terms of business and human rights." And he said, "But still, each time it's great to learn, but gee, it makes me feel uncomfortable." But he said, "That's okay, right? Because this is just something I have to understand and I have to get my head into as a future business leader, and as a growing business leader." And to hear that response, that gives me optimism.
Yeah. No, that's a very sound reason to be optimistic about. And you're absolutely right that we are all in this and we are trying to do this because we want to see a better tomorrow. And if we are not going to think of that, then there's no point to any of it. And it's very sad that, what happened in Ogoniland is what has brought us here. These changes would have happened anywhere, but you need a tipping point. And to some extent, what happened with Shell and Nigeria and Ogoniland was that tipping point. And we only hope that, as I was talking to Nimo Basi, who's from the Mother Earth Foundation, and we had a very long chat a couple of days ago, and he teaches in our courses often, and he's a friend of the Institute. And he, and in the conversation, we ended basically saying that, ultimately we have to come for the day and look forward to the day where the GDP is not measured in Nigeria with the barrels of oil or the dollars in an account, but the laughter of children. And that's the way to move forward. And thank you for all that you do, Richard, and thank you for carrying the flag and fighting the good fight, and all the very best to you in everything you do.
Thank you, Salil, and a pleasure to reflect with you 25 years later.